Memorial Day memorializes those who gave their lives to launch and sustain the American experiment. For me, their sacrifice is never far from mine, as my office borders the site of the Continental Army's encampment at Valley Forge, crucible of the American Revolution. Only steps away stands the small stone home that served as Gen. George Washington's headquarters during the brutal winter of 1777 to 1778. Scattered nearby are replicas of the low log huts his soldiers built and occupied, 12 men huddled in each, barely sheltered from the bitter cold. A year and a half earlier, the Second Continental Congress had boldly promulgated the Declaration of Independence, with its inspiring assertions of unalienable rights. But the exuberance of 1776 had dissipated. Declaring independence was challenge enough. Securing it over the armed opposition of the planet's preeminent military power proved orders of magnitude harder. What the founders drafted would matter little but for the service and suffering of the soldiers. And the army would not have survived, much less triumphed, but for Washington. He was indeed, per historian James Thomas Flexner, the indispensable man, per biographer Richard Brookhiser, the founding father. He came to Valley Forge with 11,000 men. That winter, more than a quarter of them died of disease or exposure. British troops in nearby Philadelphia were warm, well-clothed, well-fed, as were most American civilians. But little of their prosperity reached the army. Congress repeatedly failed to provide. When it did belatedly act, corruption and ineptitude often prevented the soldiers from receiving the provisions they so urgently needed. Adding insult to injury, they went months without pay. Imagine the temptation for the troops to seek a strong man. Imagine the temptation for Washington to become one. Speaking in Valley Forge on November 21, 1949, former Supreme Allied Commander and future President Dwight Eisenhower said, meeting on this spot, "It is difficult to avoid giving way to emotions so intense as to still the tongue and to leave any American silently grateful, humble, reverent." Here Washington waged and won the greatest fight of a fighting career. The long winter of the Valley Forge encampment brought to his army the last ounce of endurable suffering, while Washington was called upon to bear collapse in his rear, desertion in his ranks, hostility in his associates. The freedom of the American people here experienced its greatest danger of extinction, here met its sternest challenge. Washington's remaining men constituted a fraction of a % of the population, whose independence they were seeking to secure. But they persevered. After nearly dissolving, the army emerged stronger, more disciplined, more effective. Ultimately, after years of conflict, it prevailed. Following victory, Washington was the undisputed military and political leader of the incipient nation, plenary power his for the taking. He relinquished it all, returning to Congress his original Parchment Commission, an unprecedented act of humility and deference. Wrote Thomas Jefferson, the moderation and virtue of a single character prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish.